Welcome to Action in Business. In these times, one thing that makes the most sense right here, right now, is to secure the future of your business. Let's take action now. Here's your action coach, Jana Hoiberg.
Welcome, one and all, and thank you for tuning into this very special edition, the third installment with Dan McKenzie, nationally acclaimed negotiator, on Action in Business with your host, Action Coach, Action Jana Hoiberg, right here on News Talk 1460 KZNT Radio, where what you'll gain doesn't come from theory. It comes from Dan and Jana's real life experience. I'm your co-host, Ted Robertson. Subject on the table is don't make it worse. Basically, that's what it is. Before we get there, Jana wants to tell you about the last installment with, that would be part 2 in our series with Mr. McKenzie.
Yeah, the last segment was a lot of fun because we talked about BATNA, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and how to really use it, and some real practical examples there. And then legitimacy, which really just very much ties to what we've talked about in the past of rules of the game and why it's important and what difference it makes. And this time we're going to be talking about escalation cycles and common errors that are made across the board. So I think it'll be fun. So Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself for those who may have not been listening the last couple of weeks when we've been talking.
Okay, well, thanks. Nice to be here. I am someone who's extremely passionate about understanding how people behave, why they behave certain ways, and what to do about those particular things. It hasn't helped me a whole lot, as we were discussing earlier with my 10 and 12-year-old, but in general, we try to put those rules and lessons and make them apply to our daily lives. You know, humans, unfortunately, are not programmed or coded from birth to be perfectly behaved members of the planet. So, and each person has their own particular criteria for behavior, their own idiosyncrasies, and could just have different moods on a given day. And it really, for somebody who studies the process and the art and the science of the negotiation process, it's fascinating. And if we have time in a little bit, I'll help frame that with a quick story. But I have been studying this particular discipline now for about 16 years. I was fortunate to have studied at Harvard under some of the best professors who teach this, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And I have trained and mentored underneath some exceptionally capable people who deal in the more extreme ends of the negotiation process. And I presently live right now in North Carolina.
All right, great. Well, before we get into some of the meat of escalation cycles, if you have thoughts, comments, or observations, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me at most any time at 358-6936. That's 358-6936. Or by email at janahoiberg@actioncoach.com. That's Jana Hoiberg at actioncoach.com. If you want information about Action Coach and my upcoming events, visit me on the web at actioncoachcoloradosprings.com, and that's actioncoachcoloradosprings.com. I have an event page that you can go check out the events and customer testimonials and a wide range of information. But I've also got a fan page on Facebook, and you can just log on to Facebook and search Action in Business and become a fan of the show, and you'll get free access to the show archives and a lot of the tips that I put on there that you can actually use to apply to your business. So, Dan, as you were going over your background and the like, the thought came to my mind is you basically told me I'm not perfect and I'm moody.
Well,
so go ahead and touch base with that one. Recover from there, Dan.
Well, listen, it affords all of us. You know how many people are on the planet, and the behavioral styles are not too different. And, we can wake up in a great mood. Yes, we can be cranky, and we take that into the workplace. And this whole process, by the way, is not just limited. We're here obviously focusing on business and things which, we spend at least a third of our life, some more than that, in that location. But these are skills that we've been talking about in past segments that are really things that you can use at the grocery store. It becomes even more critical given the last couple of years, which have been a bit economically challenging. To have a better understanding of what's out there so that you can go back in and in some cases renegotiate some of the deals that you may have had in place for 5 or 6 or 7 years. And there are a lot of people who are who are understanding about the situation and who are willing to help. A lot of times I've found that people don't take the time to just simply ask. And if you make the step to do that, you would be amazed at how many people on the other end of that phone, even if you're having non-visual dialogue with that person, are willing to help, as long as you've done what a good negotiator would do, which is go and investigate your options and throw as many possible scenarios on the table as possible. A bad outcome for somebody is when they don't think about options and they don't put them on the table, and the other person is not going to bring them up.
That is exactly right. And it's one of the things I really work with my clients on, is as they have had situations in place, go back and touch base with them, negotiate, because things have changed. And a lot of times it's actually a win-win for both sides, because you might be able to get additional functionality, features, whatever. It depends on the type of product or service you're trying to negotiate. And that becomes better for both parties. And that really is, the true win-win. But what does happen a lot of times, and it's really what we're getting ready to talk about, is things escalate. Emotions play into it, and people they're looking, a lot of times they take it out on the individual as well and don't look at the problem. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think it's also important to understand that the word negotiation oftentimes has a negative connotation associated with. When people say, I'm going to go negotiate I'm going overseas to negotiate or whatever, it usually means that they're posturing for win. And as we talked about in one of the very earliest segments, we talked about the different types of negotiators. The gamesman, who's more focused on the game theory and not losing but winning. The defender, who is not necessarily interested in winning, he just doesn't want to lose. He's preparing himself to avoid direct loss. And then the principled negotiator, which is the definition that I like to use in the negotiation, which is joint gain, mutual gain, fairness, and looking for a mutually beneficial balance of interest for both parties. Because in the end, Gianna, it is critical that a good outcome, a long, sustainable outcome, must be durable. And in any situation, I don't care whether you're talking about war, I don't care whether you're talking about whatever you want to choose, something that is done at the expense of another will always fail in the end. It will always fail. It will deconstruct.
And going back and then having to renegotiate after that failure is a lot harder, because I know I've had to do it in past businesses where there's been a negotiation and it's not necessarily worked out. One of the other parties didn't live up to what was expected because they maybe couldn't have. And then going back to that table is not fun.
Well, we've talked about two things in particular today that lead us to a position where things sort of degrade a little bit. One of those was, we've talked about in the earlier segments, was the concept of landscape, topography, fortification, and flag. Those four things really protect a negotiator or someone advocating on somebody's behalf from making mistakes. And each one of those has their own criteria for understanding that specific area and place and time. And the one thing that the best tool that a negotiator can have, regardless of what they're doing or what they're advocating, is their pre-preparedness for that discussion. Understanding, I've been in many, many meetings where I will be sitting actually in the meeting and or we may be taking a break, and I might get a text from somebody who's doing research for me that comes up with this wonderful little tidbit on the company that I'm dealing with, and this just happened actually recently, and I was able to insert that right into the meeting. It had direct relevance to what I was talking about, and I had specific dollar figures, I had specific information, and it forced the other side to become distracted and look at each other across the table for me, wondering how I knew that information, and it was positive for them. However, I took them off balance because they weren't aware that I had, in some cases, sort of pre-prepared myself for that. But when you don't do that correctly, and everything fails, we inherently go into what's referred to as an escalation cycle, and that is not a good place to be.
It doesn't sound like it would be good. And I know I've been in situations where things have escalated, and that's where emotions start playing into, and tempers start coming into play, and that's when people start saying things that they really don't mean, and they fit as many of their feet as they possibly can in their mouth, and then try to figure out how to take them out without, and a lot of times at that point, they've really created a problem.
Well, it's interesting. The result of that, we talked about consequences earlier. It is a completely destructive and inefficient means of having a dialogue. All it does is destruct the. There are a number of things that we do which we shouldn't do. And we as human beings do it all the time. And I'm just going to list a couple of them for you that are probably most relevant for your listening audience. One of the things we need to always make sure that we do not do is focus on people rather than problem. This is oftentimes when we personalize the situation, and this requires training, by the way, because human nature says, you're the cause of my problem. The two things I tell people, whether I'm in the business that I run or whether I'm conducting dialogue for this, you completely eliminate the word blame and fault from your vocabulary and replace that with the word contribution, because everyone contributes. When you start using words like blame and fault, we were talking a little bit earlier about how powerful vocabulary comes in helping to avoid negative consequences of dialogue. Framing and vocabulary are key. Think about the framing. What I mean by framing, because it leads into that escalation cycle, is there are many ways to say things. And you've all been in front of people who have said things that were not necessarily meant, but not necessarily framed well.
Correct.
There are 7 different ways to say the same thing and get somebody out the other side feeling like they can still have some contribution in that dialogue.
Yeah, and we've talked about that in the past, some different ways to say things. And I have one, and I don't think we're going to have enough time to go into it, but I've got a little story that goes from there is that actually looks at if you look at your spouse and you tell them, every time I look at you, time stands still, they're complimented. If you look at your spouse and say, your face stops a clock, you are in big trouble. In both cases, they have said the exact same thing, but it goes to that, framing, right. And you're going to get a different escalation for each one of those.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I learned the hard way. Don't compare your wife's hair to your favorite dog's fur. That does not work. So that's Marriage Counseling 101, right, Jana?
That is exactly right.
It's time to take a short break, everybody. We're here with Jana Hoiberg, the best action coach on the face of the planet, with the best negotiator in the universe, Mr. Dan McKenzie. You're listening to Action in Business with your host, Action Jana Hoiberg, right here on News Talk 1460 KZNT Radio in colorful Colorado Springs. It's the most success-filled half hour in radio. We'll be right back.